thank you so much, Clara. Thanks to the economics department of the new school. It's always a pleasure to be here. It has been plenty of time, as Clara mentioned before. So, and thanks to everyone for attending and for listening to me. I'm going to share my screen, and please let me know if you can see it or not. Clara, can you see it? Fantastic. So this paper, as mentioned briefly during the presentation, it's about the debate around the possibility to extend suffrage to women during the progressive era amongst the most important economists of the time. So the debate, as you probably know, started in the US at the Seneca Fall Convention in 1848, when there was a resolution in order to promote the extension of suffrage for women. And of course, the debate ended when the Tennessee House of Representatives voted to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which forbade discrimination at the ballot on account of sex, which happened in August 1920. So this debate, of course, involved two opposite sides. On one side, those who were against suffrage for the extension of suffrage for women, they were called remonstrants or antis. And those on the other side who were in favor of the extension of suffrage for women. These two groups adopted several different arguments, and sometimes they also mixed up these arguments. The first argument that arose within the debate was a kind of moral / philosophical argument that was adopted by both groups. Detractors considered the fact that women's suffrage would have harmed the natural harmony of the society, which was based on the strict division of the roles between men and women. So men who were supposed to be more competitive, braver, and so forth, are naturally involved in fulfill their task outside the household, either in the battlefield or in the market, while women who are naturally and biologically more focused on taking care of others, they are more cooperative and so forth, are naturally considered to get a fulfillment of their own task within the household by covering the role of being wives and mothers. So besides these moral or philosophical arguments, there were two more arguments in general. The first one was much more political oriented. So the idea was, the debate was around the possible effects of the extension of the suffrage to women to the democratic system. So the idea was, what's going on if we are going to extend the suffrage to women from a political perspective? Is the democratic system, will the democratic system be affected, and how? And then we have another argument that was much more focused on economic matters. And again, it was a discussion about the effects of women's enfranchisement on economic matters, such as gender wage gaps, some measures of economic policy oriented to regulate somehow strikes or the conditions of working places, such as the working hours and so forth, and of course some effects on the distribution of income. This paper is aimed to describe three different positions. The position of male economists of the time who were against the extension of women's suffrage, male economists who were in favor of the extension of suffrage to women, and women economists of the time, who were usually in favor to the extension of the suffrage for women, but they were forced somehow to fight against so many other women who were against the extension of suffrage. I can't go, oh, I don't know what's happening with my presentation. Okay, why we are adopting the term illiberal in this paper? As we briefly mentioned during the presentation, we are somehow following up Tim Leonard's main thesis that he presented in his outstanding book, which was published in 2017, according to which many economists, first-rate, big name among economists of the progressive era, who were social reformers, not just economists, but also social reformers, who wanted to promote some specific legislation in order to better off the welfare of society, were also illiberal, because they had this kind of holistic vision, according to which the welfare of the society is much more important than the individual rights. So if there is a case in which individual rights must be constrained for the sake of the welfare of society, they must be constrained. And this is a very illiberal position. So we are going to dig into our arguments if we can find a further justification of this position expressed by Leonard. Also because when these economists of the progressive era tried to express the necessity to constrain individual rights for the sake of the society, of course, they are explicitly talking about the individual rights of minorities. And for minorities, they intended the disabled, the immigrants. Think about how many immigrants were coming into the country in that period: African Americans and women. And of course, we will be focused on just on women in this paper, of course. And for example, about women, many of them, as Leonard mentioned in his book, propose some specific labor legislation which was aimed to exclude women from the labor force because of the fact that women were the weaker sex, and the marketplace is going to be very dangerous for them. Also, they don't need to go to the marketplace, to the job market, because they are protected and by their fathers and eventually husbands. And some of them who were much more focused on eugenic, for example, also say that women's work, women in the marketplace, would have depleted heredity. And many of them converged into the claim that society is much better when women are excluded from the marketplace, because the society is based on this general, natural harmony, which might be harmed by the extension of the suffrage. The debate among economists of the time on the extension of economic suffrage was not hosted in the classical academic journals. Rather, it was hosted in the less known propaganda literature, such as national and local newspapers and magazines. This implied that Luca and I had to dig into some archives, and it's not very easy to find what we were trying to find out. And this is the first time that we are presenting this kind of literature written and published by these first-rate economists of the time on this specific subject. In general, we can say that there was an economic argument that was adopted by the two sides, pro and contra the extension of suffrage for women. It's basically the application of the concept of opportunity cost to the enlargement of suffrage for women.
Italiana?
Sorry, there's someone with the microphone on and is disturbing me. So please make sure that your microphone is switched off. According to supporters of the extension of suffrage for women, the benefits of women enfranchisement would outweigh the cost. On the opposite side, according to to detractors, the cost of women enfranchisement would outweigh the benefits, and we'll see what these meant. Another point which is important to introduce here is that the detractors of women's suffrage adopted the so-called doctrine of the separate spheres that I mentioned briefly before. Men are for war and for market. Women are for household, for taking care of the family. This is the natural division of roles between men and women. And this doctrine of the separate spheres might be intended as the most traditional way to apply the theory of comparative advantages to the division of roles between sexes. According to these detractors, the preservation of the separate spheres was not only the most ethical way to preserve a society, but it was also the most rational way to organize society. Why? Because, for example, for many reasons, but basically because, for example, to go to vote, to have political rights means to get a lot of information that women usually do not have. And this will require to them to waste their time as by performing their duties as wives and mothers. And if this happens, this would have harm the dynamics of the families upon which a good society is grounded. Also, there was another argument adopted by detractors of women's suffrage. That was the rejection of the argument that the extension of women's suffrage would have actually reduced the gender wage gap. This was a very important argument, and alas, they were right, because if we consider that the gender wage gap still persists now after 100 years of the extension of the suffrage, somehow they were right, even though they were not right in considering the initial hypothesis. But we'll talk about this. So let's try to find to present finally these three different groups. As I mentioned before, economists who were anti-suffrage, male economists who were anti-suffrage, male economists who were in favor of suffrage, and the position of women economists of the time. As I mentioned before, we are talking about big names. We are talking about presidents of the American Economic Association and full professors in the most important colleges and universities in the countries. The first was Richard Ely, who was absolutely against the suffrage for women. He wrote a pamphlet in 1908, according to which he was presenting again the so-called doctrine of the separate spheres. He claimed that women are in a lower, somehow their position is not the same men within the society, but this is an effect of their biological inferiority, and this is not an effect of an unequal treatment, legal treatment. And this is the reality, and we cannot change reality. Women are weaker, are inferior, so there's no need to change this natural condition by adopting a special legislation or by extending the suffrage. A few years years later, in 1912, he wrote an article by considering the possible effects of the extension of suffrage for women to gender wage gap in industry. And again, he claimed that, yes, it's true, there is a gender wage gap but between men and women, but this is due to the fact that women have actually an inferior economic value in the world's in the marketplace. And the extension of suffrage won't solve this problem. Ely in this paper presented some possible solution, and he presented the well-known doctrine, the well-known family wage theory, according to which married women should accept the fact that they are going to get a lower wage because they are already supported by their male members, by the male members of their family, and the male members of their family are taking care of them. So there's no need to have to reduce a possible gender gap. Also, there's no need for equal pay, which is different. I'm going to talk about this in a few moments. And he concluded by saying that the extension of suffrage for women was a great evil because it is going to erode the cohesion of families upon which, again, society is grounded, is rooted. We have another very important economist who was against the suffrage for women was Jeremiah Jenks, Cornell University, president of the American Economic Association. He claimed in 1907 that social efficiency must necessarily prevail over individual rights, including women's right to vote. Here again, we have what Leonard called the illiberal side of these social reformers and economists of the time. Thomas Nixon Carver is another very important example because he was very, very important as an economist. He wrote in 1918 a pamphlet entitled Women's Suffrage from a Neutral Point of View. I put an exclamation mark because I guess it's not neutral at all, but again, according to Carver, the family, again, is the most important part of the city, the very beginning of the city, sorry, of the society, the very beginning of the society. And in families, there is a strict division of roles. Women are mothers and wives. So there's no need for them to be citizens. There's no need for them to get political power. That is for men, with some exception, according to Carver. That's why maybe he put this label neutral point of view in his title. The exceptions are two, basically. Widows, especially young widows who are head of the families, and bachelors who are not, of course, head of the families because they are not married. Even though they are male, they are not head of the families. So for them, it's for widows, it's possible to have political rights. It makes sense because they have to lead the family, and so they basically need to get some political rights. While bachelors should be banned from having the right to vote. So here again, because they are not the head of the family. Here again, yes.
Can I add something about Thomas Nixon Carver? This pamphlet, there is somehow an amusing...
Yes, just this is Luca, my co-author.
It was commissioned by women. It was commissioned by women. So this pamphlet, this very harsh pamphlet, but probably the harshest material which we have found, was actually commissioned by women.
Yes, that's another point that it's important to understand. These male economists who were against women's suffrage, the extension of women's suffrage, were working strictly connected with so many women of the time who were against the extension of women's suffrage precisely because they were supporters of this doctrine of the separate spheres. And then we have Yale's Adley and Farnham, who were also among those who were against suffrage, even though we don't have time to talk about any single pamphlet they wrote. Sorry, what's going on? Okay, here we have the second group of male economists who were in favor of the extension of suffrage for women. They were basically all around the country, but one of the most important center was Columbia University in New York, because New York was one of the headquarters of the fight, of the battle for the extension of suffrage for women. And here you have Seeger, Bird, and Mitchell. They all were in favor of women's suffrage, as I mentioned before. Seeger wrote that women's suffrage will reduce the gender wage gap, especially because it will promote some protective legislation, especially for women who worked in the public sector. Bird look at the women's suffrage as an inevitable effect of the extension of the democratic system. So he was not focused on economic argument, on a specific economic argument. He was much more focused on the political side of the story. Mitchell, quite the opposite, was much more focused on the economic aspect of this story, and he claimed that women must be granted to vote because they are the most important consumer agents. So given that their economic roles is so important because they are the most important consumers, it's fair and it's also efficient to grant them to vote. In the academic years 1913, 1914, Joseph Schumpeter was visiting Columbia University, was a visiting professor there, and he joined the debate by writing a very very outstanding pamphlet. In this pamphlet, he said two fundamental things. First, there's no way to stop the progression of democracy, and women must be granted to vote because they are citizens like men. So a gender equality outside the household, it's inevitable. Second, it should be also very, very welcome the fact that men should be much more present in handling with the issues within household, which is a very modern position adopted by Schumpeter. Outside New York, we have Davenport, Pattern, and Dubois. Davenport wrote a pamphlet in 1916, The Economics of Feminism, which is one of the first, maybe the first in the United States, which combined the same title, economics and feminism. And in this pamphlet, Davenport harshly criticized the notion of conspicuous consumption introduced by Baker as very dangerous for women. And he promoted a general program of reforms, which included not only the extension of suffrage for women, but also some more specific measures, such as equal pay for equal work for both sexes and a reduction of work time. Pattern was against the theory of the family wage that I mentioned before, that was promoted and reinforced by Ely, and he was against the doctrine of the separate sphere. So according to Pattern, women's vote is a rational way of reinforcing social harmony. So somehow he was adopting the same argument, this idea that the family family dynamics are related with the well-being, the welfare of society, but he overcomes the argumentation. So when there is equality between partners in family, this equality goes straight to the society, and the society is going to be better off. Dubois, of course, was another economist who promoted the extension of suffrage, and he considered the extension of suffrage for women and for African-American people as the two sides of the same coin. Of course, the coin was the egalitarian principle. Here we have some women economists of the time. They were all pro-suffrage, but as I mentioned before, they were forced to fight against so many women who were against. I'm not mentioning all of them. You can read them, their name here. And I'm just saying that some of them adopted a moral argument, so the equality between among any individuals, regardless of gender. Some others adopted a much more economic argument, basically related with the gender wage gap. And some others consider the extension of suffrage not as an end in itself, but a mean to a final aim. The final aim is the increase of social well-being. Most of them consider the extension of suffrage particularly important for Black American women who were a double minority as women and as people of color. There were so many examples. We just mentioned a couple of them. The first is the debate that was hosted in 1909 in the Chicago Tribune. It was between an anti-suffragist, Mrs. Corbin, versus Jane Addams and Marion Talbot. Marion Talbot was the first woman economist at the University of Chicago. Corbin presented to the Senate the same anti-argument which resembled the Ellys and Carvers. So the same argument according to which men and women stands are unequal from a biological and natural point of view. So there's no need to make them equal because this is going to harm the society as a whole and the nation as a whole, because the nation is founded on society. Talbot and Adams replied that it's not true that men and women within the household are so unequal. They have some agreement, the same commitment in order to make the household work. And this same commitment must be translated, must be shifted into the society. And this is going to strengthen the society as a whole and also the nation. Another very important debate occurred between Minnie Bronson, who was a very active anti-suffrage. She wrote a very specific pamphlet, very, very well, in which she very well expressed her position of anti-suffrage. And Breckinridge and Abbott, two women economists of the time, quite popular, replied to her point by point. So Bronson started the pamphlet by saying that women's suffrage is useless, is a useless cause for society, because if you want to better off the position of women workers, there's no need to grant them to vote. The fact that the number of women workers was increasing, that's enough for promoting a legislation to protect them. Breckinridge and Abbott claimed that, replied that there is no trade-off between granting vote to women and assuming and promoting a protective legislation to better off the condition of women workers. So the trade-off expressed by Bronson is a nonsense. Another nonsense is the second argument by Bronson, according to which the extension of women's suffrage won't reduce the numbers of strikes. That was a huge debate at the time about the nature of strikes. According to the Breckinridge and Abbott, strikes were not for the strikes at the time were not for suffrage. So it's a nonsense to combine these. And again, Bronson claimed that there is some evidence according to which a better protective legislation has passed in non-suffrage states. And Breckinridge and Abbott claim a reply that yes, of course, this is true, but the problem is the issue is that the legislation has been promoted by suffragists. So can you imagine if we can grant the vote to women, what's going on to legislative, to protective legislation? It's gonna be much better. And here is another very specific point. Suffrage, according to Bronson, does not guarantee equal pay for equal work and does not reduce gender wage gap. Because gender wage gap is an effect not of a specific discrimination, but it's a consequence of the law of supply and demand. Market demands women as workers who are low profile than men who are higher profile. According to Breckinridge and Abbott, there's no need, they claim, there's no need to talk about the almost sacred character of supply and demand law. And the main point here is to consider the labor legislation as inadequate. If the labor legislation might help to introduce equal pay for equal works and to reduce gender wage gap, this might be also an effect of the extension of suffrage for women. This point is very important for two reasons. I'm going to rush here because I'm running out of time. First, equal pay for equal works and gender wage gap are not the same. Equal pay might be introduced by a form of legislation. Gender wage gap is different. Gender wage gap depends on gender labor gap, and gender labor gap might be a direct effect of women's choice or forced choice, for example, to accept part-time jobs versus full-time jobs, to deny extra hours, and so forth. So gender wage gap still persists today. So there's no evidence that the political enfranchisement of women would have led to a radical change, to a radical erosion of gender wage gap. This is important to claim. And this was one of the most specific point that were treated by another important women economists of the time, Ellen Sumner Woodbury. Gender wage gap, Woodbury insisted, it is present even in public sector. For example, in public school teachers or postal service employees. But for the reason that I mentioned before, and that Woodbury mentioned in her pamphlet. Very briefly, another women economist of the time, Emily Hutchinson, claimed that the extension of suffrage for women was not simply a matter of justice, but also a question of social welfare. And let me finish with Giandomenica Becchio. We already met her in the debate against Bronson, along with Abbott. She clearly pointed out that if there is a gender inequality in the marketplace, it's because there are some gender biases which are cultural factors, not economic factors, which influence gender wage gap. So the extension of women's suffrage would lead to an affirmative action which will be able to reduce somehow the gender inequality among men and women. And this affirmative action will be focused not only in a specific legislation for wages, for example, but also for reducing sorry, it's my timer, for reducing gender educational gap. For example, it should be consider the importance of educational investments in technical and professional schools for girls. That would open up a new position for female workers, and that will reduce in the long run the gender inequality in the market. So some conclusion here. We have seen that there were many illiberal elements in economists like in Carver and as well as in many anti-suffrage women. We also noticed that even male economists who supported women's suffrage, they did it with some ambiguities because they are somehow reinforcing this idea that the social harmony depends on the family, but they are somehow overcoming the arguments. Bird, for example, praised the biological virtues of women, which must be reinforced by the extension of the suffrage. So it's the same argument that was adopted by Ely and Carver, just they are counter-reacting by saying that suffrage will reinforce this social harmony, while on the opposite side, the suffrage will harm this social, harmony. How about women economists of the time? Well, they were fighters. They fought in favor of women's suffrage, and they were forced to fight against their gender peers, let's say so. And they adopted a multifaceted approach. Some of them adopted the moral/philosophical argument, and some of them adopted the political argument. Many of them adopted the economic arguments. Some of them, as I mentioned before, were forward-looking because they understood that the problem of gender inequality within the market was not related only with the extension of suffrage. It's a much broader and much more complex problem. So I guess I've done, and I thank you very much, and I'm looking forward for your comments and questions. And I know that Luca is here, my co-author, so Luca is entitled, of course, to join me. And sorry, because I need to reactivate my video. Here it is. Thank you so much.